Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So let's start off, inshallah ta'ala. We're going to actually start with someone who's not a companion of the Prophet ﷺ, but is a very interesting figure in our religion, and that is Luqman al-Hakim alayhi salam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala obviously has named an entire surah about Luqman al-Hakim, or after Luqman al-Hakim. He is a man that the Prophet ﷺ spoke about frequently. We find many ahadith about Luqman's wisdom, and the capacity in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions him in the Quran is of a man with deep wisdom and advice. And so the conversation between him and his son, the advices that he gives to him, has become the subject of numerous khutbahs and lectures and classes around the world. So he's a very, subhanAllah, compelling character, to say the least. Now, who is Luqman al-Hakim? Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu says, and again, anything that's related to the Prophet ﷺ or related to the Arabs tends to be referenced. Abdullah ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu says that Luqman was a dark-skinned man with big lips, coarse feet, someone that had a very prominent appearance, very, very much so looked Abyssinian. And he says that he was kidnapped and taken into slavery around 1,000 years before the Prophet ﷺ in the area of Palestine, in the area of Palestine. So he was actually an Abyssinian slave about 1,000 years before the Prophet ﷺ in the area of Palestine. And Ibn al-Jawzi rahimahullah, in his book Tanwir al-Ghabas, he actually has a narration of a meeting between Dawood alayhi salam and Luqman al-Hakim. It's very interesting that Ibn al-Jawzi says that Dawood alayhi salam met Luqman al-Hakim in a gathering, and he noticed that Luqman al-Hakim wasn't opening his mouth, he wasn't speaking. So he went to him and he said, why is it that you don't speak a lot? Why is it that you stay so silent? And he said beautiful words. He said that speech is meaningless except when speaking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And silence is meaningless unless you're thinking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when you speak, you should speak about Allah. And when you think, you should think about Allah. Otherwise, both your speaking and your silence are without purpose. So subhanAllah, that's a beautiful narration. And Allahu Alam, if that particular incident is authentic, but it certainly does fall in line with the image that the Prophet ﷺ painted of Luqman al-Hakim. Rasulullah ﷺ, he says that Luqman al-Hakim once said, "As-samtu hikmah wa qalilun fa'ilu," that silence is wisdom and very few practice it. So Luqman is someone that's known for his silence. He's someone that is deeply perceptive, extremely wise. And there's also a hadith about Luqman al-Hakim that his master once told him, he said, bring me the best part of the sheep. I want you to cook the best part of the sheep and bring it. So Luqman al-Hakim cooked the tongue and he brought it to him. And he said, bring me the worst part of the sheep. So Luqman al-Hakim once again cooked the tongue and brought it to him. And so his master told him, when I asked you for the best and the worst part of the sheep, you brought me the tongue both times. And Luqman al-Hakim said that this tongue, if it is used for the dhikr of Allah, for the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and for enjoining good and forbidding evil, it is the best part of the body. And if it's used for evil, lying, backbiting, slander, so on and so forth, then it is the worst part of the body. So Luqman is someone, subhanAllah, with great wisdom and great depth. And in fact, what we see, historically speaking, is that he was freed from slavery due to his wisdom. So he became a legend amongst the Arabs. The Arabs all knew Luqman al-Hakim, which is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala employs his mention in the Quran. Because this is someone that they could relate to. The pagan Arabs used to quote Luqman al-Hakim for his wisdom. And he was a muwahhid, he was a monotheist. And so Luqman al-Hakim was freed from slavery and subhanAllah occupied a deep, a great rank and a deep position in his society. Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala, he says, قِيلَ لِلُقْمَانِ, that some people once said to Luqman, مَا بَلَغَ بِكَ مَا نَرَى, what is it that allowed you to reach the position that you've reached? Because it was very awkward for them to see an Abyssinian slave that was so respected in his society, freed and given a position of nobility. يُرِيدُونَ الْفَضْلِ, they meant his position. What is it that allowed you to reach such a lofty position? فَقَالَ لُقْمَانِ صِدْقُ الْحَدِيثِ وَأَدَاءُ الْأَمَانَةِ وَتَرْكُ مَا لَا يَعْنِينِي, which means he says that it was truthfulness in speech, fulfilling my trusts, and abandoning that which doesn't concern me. So these are things that are obviously Islamic values that the Prophet ﷺ spoke about often. Okay, truthful speech, fulfilling your trusts, and leaving that which doesn't concern you. And Imam Al-Qurtubi rahimahullah, he narrates that there was once a man that was staring at Luqman in his position, you know, subhanAllah, looking as he looked and occupying the demanding the respect, commanding the respect, not demanding but rather commanding the respect amongst the people that he did. And he was staring at him, and Luqman al-Hakim said to him, if you see me having thick lips, because Luqman obviously had very big lips and that was something that was very prominent about him. He said, if you see me having big lips, then know that nothing comes from them except for gentle speech. And he said, and if you see my skin being exceedingly dark, then know that my heart is exceedingly light. So subhanAllah, you know, don't judge by the appearance, and there's more to what the eye meets, especially in a society where, again, the Abyssinians were enslaved, and so on and so forth. So he's someone, subhanAllah, that occupies a very interesting position. The debate is he a prophet or not? Was he considered a Nabi of Allah? I mean, a surah is named after him. And it's common that we say Luqman al-Hakim alayhi salam. So he's spoken about like a prophet. I would argue that the average Muslim probably assumes that he's a prophet. And the debate all surrounds one ayah, which is when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَقَدْ آتَيْنَا لُقْمَانَ الْحِكْمَةِ, that we bestowed upon Luqman wisdom. So the meaning of the word hikmah here, wisdom, is it prophethood or is it wisdom? Is it a special type of wisdom? Or is it the wisdom which necessitates prophethood? The majority of scholars, they said that he was not a prophet. Those that said that he was a prophet include Ikramah, Sa'id ibn Musayyib, Al-Layth ibn Sa'ad, the teacher of Imam Malik. So they believe that he was a prophet. Now, why is it that the majority say that he's not a prophet? It would appear to be that he was. Number one, you have to prove the nubuwwah, you have to prove the prophethood of someone to be sure. So there's really nothing to base the conclusion of prophethood on. All right, because it's not without precedent that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions someone who's not a prophet by name and gives their examples and so on and so forth. There's nothing to really establish his prophethood. Number two, and this is the most conclusive or decisive of the proofs that he's not a prophet, is that we said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends a prophet from amongst his people. Okay? وَمَا كُنَّا مُعَذِّبِينَ حَتَّى نَبْعَثَ رَسُولًا وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَا مِن رَسُولٍ إِلَّا بِلِسَانِ قَوْمِهِ. He was not in the language of his people. He was not amongst the, he was not an Arab. He was not speaking their language naturally. He learned Arabic. Okay? So because he was not amongst them, all right, then that would mean that he probably was not a prophet of Allah. Ibn Kathir rahimahullah ta'ala, he narrates the story of Luqman al-Hakim, and he says that Luqman al-Hakim was a perceptive man. He was someone that used to engage with his surroundings. So he used to stare at the animals, he used to stare at the trees. You know, subhanAllah, the power of perception, Allah calls them ulul albab, people of perception, people who have perceptive power. Some people are absent-minded wherever they are, and you know, they can't live without their phones and their devices. That obviously stops you from being a perceptive person when you're just constantly glued into a screen. They're not paying attention to anything around them. And you have some people that notice the colors, they notice the small things around them, right? And they think a lot and they contemplate a lot. So Luqman al-Hakim was a man of tadabbur and tafakkur. He says that he used to constantly stare at his surroundings, and his master would ask him, you know, what do you see? And Luqman al-Hakim would say words of poetry and wisdom about the tree, about the animals, about the stars, and so on and so forth. So he says that one day while Luqman al-Hakim was sleeping under a tree, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ba'atha ilayhi malak. Allah sent him an angel. And the angel said to him that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wishes to bestow a gift upon you. Now, by the way, angels coming to people that were not prophets in the previous was very common. So this is not something that is unusual, that an angel would go to someone who's not a prophet. The story of the three men from Bani Israel, for example, the Prophet ﷺ mentioned a man who suffered from leprosy, a man who suffered from blindness, a man who suffered from baldness, and Allah sends an angel to them, right, to offer them a gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, a cure and some rizq, from some sustenance from Allah. So Allah sends an angel to Luqman al-Hakim, and the angel says, Allah wishes to bestow this gift upon you. And he gives him two choices. Either you can choose al-hikmah, wisdom, or you can choose al-mulk, to be a king. So Luqman al-Hakim chose wisdom. And so Luqman al-Hakim after that incident, he noticed that his senses and his wisdom was sharpened. Okay, so he found himself, subhanAllah, able to understand things even at a deeper level than he was before. And he thanked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he made sajda, and he praised Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for that. So this is the man. I mean, imagine in a society, that enslaves the Abyssinians, and you have this man that occupies a position of prominence, without wealth, without authority, but simply due to his wisdom, and becomes one that is consulted by his people, to the point that even a prophet of Allah, all right, like Dawood alayhi salam, is amazed by him. Okay, so this is a very interesting man, and someone that, subhanAllah, is very beautiful, and someone that the Prophet ﷺ speaks highly of. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, through giving us a glimpse of the conversation of Luqman with his son, we learn much about his wisdom. And we find in Sahih al-Bukhari that the Sahaba were concerned with the ayah, الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَلَمْ يَلْبِسُوا إِيمَانَهُم بِظُلْمٍ. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, those who believe and they don't cover their iman, they don't cover their faith with transgression, with dhulm, oppression. The Sahaba were afraid from that ayah because they thought that, well, we all commit transgressions. We inevitably will make mistakes. We'll inevitably, say something that's going to hurt somebody, or so on and so forth. So does that mean we're kuffar? Does that mean we've committed shirk? Does that mean we're disbelievers? He said, no. He said, rather, it's what Luqman al-Hakim said to his son, لا تشرك بالله إن الشرك لظلم عظيم. When the Prophet ﷺ said that shirk, polytheism, or associating a partner with Allah, is a great transgression. So he said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala means that. We find that the Prophet ﷺ frequently quoted the wisdom of Luqman al-Hakim. So he says, he expands upon the conversations between Luqman and his son. And this is beautiful because you can see Luqman was someone that had a great relationship with his child. He used to talk to him a lot, advise him a lot. And one of the things the Prophet ﷺ said, he told his son, he said, Ya bunay, O my son, i'mal li dunyaka ma baqaka fiha. Work for this world in accordance with how long you will live in it, and work for the hereafter in accordance with how long you will live in it. SubhanAllah. So he's a very, meaning if you divide the amount of time you'll spend in this world to the amount of time you will spend in the hereafter, that's how much of your effort should be dedicated to each. So the Prophet ﷺ quoted his hikmah, his wisdom, to his son. We find a hadith from the Messenger ﷺ, which is narrated in Mustadrak al-Imam al-Hakim, that the Prophet ﷺ says, خَيْرُ السُّدَانِ ثَلَاثَةً. The best of all black people are three. The best of all blacks that have walked the face of the earth are three. He says, Luqman wa Bilal wa Mihja'. Luqman, Bilal, and a man by the name of Mihja', who we'll talk about inshaAllah ta'ala. There's a weaker version of the hadith by As-Suyuti which mentions Najashi as well, which mentions the ruler of Abyssinia as well. So the Prophet ﷺ praised him as being of the three best of black people that have ever walked the face of the earth. We also find in Imam al-Qurtubi's tafsir, in Surah Luqman, he says that Sa'id ibn Musayyib, radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, he found a man that was, he found a black man who was down on himself. And what that means is, self-hatred, right? That obviously develops in a racist society. Sometimes you'll have people that feel like, why was I born in this color? Why do I belong to these people? And so on and so forth. And Sa'id ibn Musayyib went to him and he said, لا تحزن من أنك أسود. Do not grieve because you have black skin. He says, فَإِنَّهُ كَانَ مِنْ خَيْرِ النَّاسِ ثَلَاثَةٌ مِنَ السُّدَانِ. He says, three of the best people that have ever walked the face of the earth also had black skin. He says, Bilal, wa Mihja' wa Luqman. The same three people that the Prophet ﷺ mentioned. So he's from the greatest of all time amongst, specifically those who had black skin and mankind as a whole, according to Sa'id ibn Musayyib. Now, what survived from Luqman in the Arab world at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and why is his mention so significant here? Because Luqman al-Hakim, the wisdom or the principles of Luqman, Amthal Luqman, used to circulate amongst the Arabs. So you had all these analogies and all these words of poetry and principles, right, that people used to ascribe to Luqman al-Hakim, who was a monotheist. So Allah is calling the Arabs with someone that was recognizable to them. And in fact, we find that in the poetry of Jahiliyyah, the poetry of the Arabs before Islam, Luqman's name is frequently mentioned. Even in the most famous, like Labid and others, the most famous poets of the Arabs used to use the name of Luqman. Some people even possessed books or writings or scrolls of the principles of Luqman al-Hakim. In fact, we find that the Prophet ﷺ, he met a Sahabi by the name of Suwaid ibn Samit. And Suwaid ibn Samit, he met the Prophet ﷺ. And it said that Suwaid, by the way, was the very first person from Medina to be influenced by the Prophet ﷺ. Suwaid was from Medina, and years before the Hijrah, he went to Mecca for Hajj, the pagan Hajj. And when he went to Mecca for the pagan Hajj, he met the Prophet ﷺ. And he heard the Prophet ﷺ's preaching. And Rasulullah ﷺ, towards the later years in Mecca, before he did Hijrah, the Prophet ﷺ used to preach to the pilgrims from other areas, to the Hujjaj that were coming from other areas, in hopes that, that someone would accept him. So Suwaid, when he heard the Prophet ﷺ, he said that, I have something similar to that which you're saying. So the Prophet ﷺ said, what is it? He said, I have Amthal Luqman, I have the principles of Luqman. And he had a scroll. So the Prophet ﷺ asked to hear some of it. So he started to read some of the sayings of Luqman al-Hakim. And Rasulullah ﷺ said, what you have is good, and what I have is better. And the Prophet ﷺ then started to recite the Quran to him. And Suwaid said that this is indeed better, even better than what I have of Luqman al-Hakim alayhi salam. And he accepted Islam. So he's one of the first people to accept Islam. Now, by the way, there is a book that's called Amthal Luqman al-Hakim, right, which is actually not, it's actually, historically speaking, there's no way to trace it to Luqman al-Hakim. Okay, so the book that circulates today, or not circulates, but there is a book, a famous book called Amthal Luqman. There's really nothing more but a bunch of just wise sayings that have been attributed to him. But historically speaking, you can't find any way to trace it to him, alayhi salam. Now, what about his death? SubhanAllah, Ibn al-Jawzi, rahimahullah, he says that when Luqman al-Hakim was dying, his son came to him once again. So subhanAllah, he's close to his son. His son came to him and said, Ma yubkik, why are you crying? He said, I'm not crying because of that which I've left behind me, but instead I'm crying due to that which lies ahead of me. So I'm not crying about what I'm leaving behind, I'm crying about that which lies ahead of me. So this fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this fear of the hereafter was something that's deeply embedded in Luqman al-Hakim alayhi salam. Ibn al-Jawzi rahimahullah ta'ala said that he's buried in Palestine, in Palestine, in the city of Ramla. And Ramla is a city where there are over 700 prophets that are buried. The ulama say there are over 700 prophets in that area of Palestine that are buried. So he occupies a great position in Islam. He's someone that's very close to the Prophet. He's very close to the Arabs. His mention was very much so sacred, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, makes his mention a deep part of the Quran, one of the most studied portions of the Quran. Now, what about Sahaba? Now, the first person that I'm going to mention lived in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, but he's not a Sahabi. Why is that? Because he never met the Prophet ﷺ. But he plays an extremely important role in Islamic history. One of the most underrated men in Islamic history, for sure. Ashama ibn Abjar. Ashama ibn Abjar, otherwise known as An-Najashi. Okay, so the Negus of Abyssinia. Ashama ibn Abjar was his name. Najashi, in English it's Negus, Negus, is the title, similar to Caesar. Okay, it's the title of the person who would rule Abyssinia. Rasulullah ﷺ said, testifying to his adl, to his justice, he said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, if you go to Abyssinia, it is best for you. He said, because they have a ruler in Abyssinia that will not tolerate injustice. So stay there until Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala relieves you of your distress. So the first 2 hijras in Islam were to Abyssinia. There are 2 hijras, 2 migrations, they were both to Abyssinia. And the Prophet ﷺ sent some of the greatest of the Sahaba to Abyssinia, including his own daughter, okay, Ruqayya, with Uthman radiallahu anhu, Uthman ibn Affan, his cousin, Ja'far ibn Abi Talib. Some of the greatest of the companions made hijrah to Abyssinia. Abu Bakr was on his way to Abyssinia, right before he was stopped and given protection from one of the people on the outskirts of Mecca. So the Prophet ﷺ trusted this man and expressed that level of confidence in him, sending him the greatest of his companions without ever having met him. SubhanAllah. So it's a fascinating character. Some of the ulama, they say that the ayah in Surah Al-Ma'idah, which is verse 83 of Surah Al-Ma'idah, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions Christians crying out of the fear of Allah, that this is actually about a Najashi. Okay, so Imam al-Suyuti said this is referring to a Najashi, that when he would hear the Quran, even as he was a Christian, right, his heart was moved, which would lead him to become Muslim. Okay, now we said the word Najashi is like Caesar. Okay, Najashi comes from the Abyssinian word Najash, which means ziyada, which means increase. So Najash is someone that has a position higher than everyone else. Najash means increase, ziyada, increase. His actual name, Ashama, in the Arabic equivalent of it is Atiyah, which means a gift. Okay? This man, subhanAllah, has one of the most fascinating stories, which we will see, even as in Hollywood culture, by the way. SubhanAllah, one of the most fascinating stories in history. Most Muslims only know the story of Najashi from when the time the Sahaba met him. But how did he become king? How did he get to that position? How did he establish such a level of prominence and such a reputation that the Prophet ﷺ expresses that confidence in him? So he had this statement. And Najashi had a famous saying that he would say. He used to say, Allah did not take a bribe from me when He gave me back my kingdom. So how can I take a bribe for my kingdom? Allah did not take a bribe from me when He gave me back my kingdom. So how can I take a bribe for my kingdom? You understand from this what? That there was an attempt to unseat him, and successful attempt to take him away from the kingdom, right? And he used to also say, and Allah did not do what they wanted Him to do against me. So how can I do what they want me to do against Allah? Allah did not do what they wanted Him to do against me. So how can I do what they want me to do against Allah? So you understand from this statement that some people invoked Allah to do something to Najashi, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not do what they wanted Him to do, so He did not respond to an evil supplication against him. So he's saying, how can I disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? How can I do against Allah what they want me to do? Now, I want you to imagine if you lived under a Najashi, and you heard him always saying these two things, but you had no idea why. That was the state of many of the Sahaba. And Najashi would always make these two comments, and the Sahaba didn't know what he meant. So Urwa ibn Zubayr radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he once said to Imam al-Zuhri, he said, do you know what a Najashi meant when he used to always say that? He said what? He said that, I asked Aisha radiallahu anha, al-Mu'mineen, and she asked the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, what are these two famous statements of a Najashi? Right? That Allah did not take my kingdom, or Allah did not take a bribe from my kingdom. So how can I take a bribe? Okay? And Allah did not do what they wanted Him to do against me. So how can I do against Allah what they want me to do? What does that even mean? So Aisha learned from the Prophet ﷺ his story. And it's actually historically consistent, meaning it's consistent with history as a whole, the history of Abyssinia as a whole, the narration of Aisha radiallahu anha. She said that Najashi, and I want you guys to think about movies that you've watched, all right, and try to compare to this story. She says that Najashi's father was the king. And so he was the Najashi, basically. Najashi was the son of the Najashi, which is hereditary rule, right? But Ashama was the only son. So there's the king, the Najashi, and he has one son, and that son is Ashama. The brother of the king, who would be the uncle of Najashi, all right, the uncle of Ashama. Are you guys getting confused with the names? All right. The brother of the father of Ashama, who was the Najashi of the time, the ruler of the time, meaning his uncle. He had 12 sons. So you have the uncle with 12 sons, you have the king with one son. So the Abyssinians were afraid. Why were they afraid? Think about modern day monarchies and things of that sort. Well, there's only one son, so if something happens to that one son, the entire, rule, the entire monarchy is jeopardized. So they were very worried about what's going to happen. So they wanted to assassinate the father of Ashama All right, the people plotted to assassinate the father of Ashama with his uncle. So his uncle was in on it. All right, so that the brother could become the ruler while Ashama was too young. All right, Ashama, the only son, is very young. So they said, let's kill his father so that the rule will transfer to his brother. All right, so that he has 12 sons and it can, and the monarchy is stable that way. So while Ashama was still a young boy, they assassinated his father. His uncle plotted against his father, and the people plotted and they killed his father. Now, he's still a young boy, and the uncle who would become the Najashi didn't want him to know. And this is subhanAllah real life history. This isn't a Hollywood movie. It's really amazing. It's fascinating. He didn't want him to know that he killed his father, and he wanted to hide it from him. And so it was sort of like an understood that he had nothing to do with it, and so on and so forth. The uncle becomes the king. He takes Ashama in with the rest of his children. All right? And the idea is now, well, the rule of Abyssinia has transferred now to his uncle and to his kids. Now what ends up happening is that as he starts to grow up, he grows up with his uncle, and his uncle's like his father. He grows up with the rest of his cousins as if they're his brothers, and so on and so forth. Ashama was so intelligent and so superior in intelligence to all the rest of the kids that people were afraid that he was going to figure out what happened and he was going to dethrone his uncle, and that everything was going to go back into chaos. So, and they also worried because he was so close to his uncle, because he was so superior in his intelligence and everything like that, they were worried that Ashama was going to win over his uncle, and again, it was going to destabilize everything because he didn't have any kids. So what's going to happen? So those same people that plotted with him that plotted with the uncle to kill the ruler, they took him to the side and they said, look, he's about to figure out, and he might already know that you killed his father. So you need to kill him. Because if you don't kill him now, he's gonna rise up, he's gonna retake the kingdom, and it's gonna be chaos all over again. So the uncle, he said, look, I already killed his father. I'm not gonna kill him. He was close to him. He said, but here's what we'll do. This was his mercy. He said, I'll deport him and we'll put him in slavery. So we'll get him out of here. We'll sell him into slavery somewhere out of this land. So he'll go somewhere else and everything will be, settled because he can't unseat me then. And that was his, subhanAllah, it's like the brothers of Yusuf alayhi salam, right? The guy with mercy says, let's not kill him, let's just throw him into a well where he'll be picked up and he'll be enslaved. So that's his idea of mercy, is let's just sell him into slavery. We don't have to kill him, and that's not necessary. So what ends up happening is he confides in his 12 sons. He says, listen, and the number is 12 also, subhanAllah. He confides in his 12 sons and he says, listen, capture him, take him to the slave market, sell him, and make sure that the person you sell him to is from a faraway land, so he's not going to be around this area. So the brothers capture Ashama. They take him to the slave market. They sold him for 600 dirhams to a man that came from overseas. So he actually was on a boat. So the man takes Ashama, chains him up, puts him on his boat, and he starts to go out away from the land of Abyssinia. Are you guys following the story yet? All right. When they set out, there are all kinds of clouds, but there is no rain. All right? So because there is no rain coming, the people start to suffer from a drought. So they asked the king, who's the uncle of Ashama, they said, go out and do istisqa. Go out and ask Allah for rain. Remember, they're Christians. So go out and ask God for rain. So the uncle who's in charge, the emperor of Abyssinia, the Najashi of Abyssinia, he goes out and he makes dua with the people for rain, and suddenly a strike of lightning kills him. So he's dead. Now subhanAllah, when this man dies now, it passes on to his son. The kingdom passes on to his son, right? So one of his 12 sons has to become Najashi. All of his children, his 12 sons, were incompetent. And they didn't know what they were doing. So it became chaos because they were trying to figure out basically which one of these 12 sons is the least in stupidity that can take over and that can continue to be the king. So the people got so frustrated with trying to figure things out with the kids that they said, you know what, let's go find Ashama and let's just put him in charge again. All right? So subhanAllah, imagine this. They say we have to rectify the situation. They go out and they start looking for Ashama. So they start, they start trying to find out who the guy was that bought him, where he was sold into slavery. They go to that man's land, they find him, they attack that man, they steal Ashama back, they bring him back to Abyssinia, and they put him on the throne and put a crown on his head. And they say, you're our king now. Subhanallah, the turn of events, right? So he's the king now. He's the Najashi now. And it's really amazing because what ends up happening is that master, the guy that bought him, okay? And the people are very happy because they know how intelligent Ashama is, and they didn't want the kingdom now going to these 12 idiots. So they said, well, you have to be the king now. So he's the Najashi now. That master came back, and he came to Najashi to complain. He said, look, I gave 600 dirhams. I don't know anything about your internal politics in Abyssinia, but I bought you as a slave. It's not fair. So, you have to figure this out. And Najashi, he turns to the people and he says, look, he says, either you give him back his money or you give him back his slave. Allahu Akbar. Look at the man's justice. And that's the Prophet ﷺ praised his sense of justice. He said, look, you sold me as a slave to him for 600 dirhams. Either give him back his money or give him back his slave to do justice. So they said, no, we'll give him back his money. So they gave him back his 600 dirhams. And subhanAllah, lo and behold, you have this man whose father was murdered. And the murder of his father was hidden from him by his uncle. His uncle was killed. He was sold into slavery. The sons of his uncle turned out to be incompetent. The people went and got him from slavery and put him back in a position of rule. Look at the decree of Allah, the qadr of Allah. Why is this all happening? To prepare him for the Prophet ﷺ and for the Muslims that would come to his land. So this is the amazing qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Al-Najashi assumes the rule, and he's one of the most competent kings that in the history of Abyssinia. He establishes it economically. He manages to ward off all the enemies because he's allied again with the Romans in the face of the Persians. He's known for his justice. He's known for his benevolence. And the Prophet ﷺ sends out a group of Sahaba to him. So you had Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, you had Uthman ibn Affan, you had Ruqayya, the daughter of the Prophet ﷺ. You had Az-Zubayr ibn Awam, one of the 10 promised paradise. You had his wife, Asma bint Abi Bakr. So the daughter of Abu Bakr is there. Salama radiallahu ta'ala anha, Abu Salama. I mean, you're talking about the best of the companions. The Prophet ﷺ wants them to go there to settle so that just in case the persecution becomes severe, this small group of people would be able to continue on the message of Islam. That's why he chose ﷺ the best of the bunch to send to Abyssinia. So Salama radiallahu ta'ala anha, now obviously she marries the Prophet ﷺ much later, and her husband, and we covered this in the mothers of the believers, Abu Salama was one of the most beloved companions to the Prophet ﷺ. He was one of the greatest Sahaba. Salama and Abu Salama, they reached Abyssinia, and Salama radiallahu anha, she narrates basically what happened in Abyssinia when she married the Prophet ﷺ and she came back to Medina and so on and so forth. So she says that when we reached Abyssinia, we sent for a Najashi, and we sent a message to him saying that we are a people who worship one God like you, and we're looking for a place to safely practice and worship. And our Prophet said that you are a man that will implement justice and that will make sure that no injustice touches us. So she says that Najashi received us, and he accommodated us, and he, subhanAllah, he didn't even make us feel like foreigners, like we didn't feel like we were muhajirin. He basically told them, anything that you need, you have it. He integrated them into that society, subhanAllah, in every way possible. He would send food to them daily. This is before Najashi hears the message of Islam. All because Najashi was told that this group of people was worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they were persecuted by the pagans for that reason. And they were told that they would be safe in your land by their Prophet. So he's taking care of them in an amazing way. Now obviously this boosts the morale of the Muslims, even in Mecca, to know that Najashi, the leader of Abyssinia, is on their side and is taking care of the Muslims. And so there's going to be multiple migrations. So Quraysh wants to stop this, not just because of that group of Muslims that's there, which is the cream of the crop. They want to stop this so this doesn't become a trend, that everyone's just going to go settle in Abyssinia, they're going to get stronger, then they're going to come back and wipe us out, right? So they want to stop this very, very early on. So when they hear about it, Quraysh sends two of their smartest negotiators. They send Amr ibn al-As radiallahu anhu, And they said Abdullah ibn Abi Rabi'ah, Amr ibn al-As, and Abdullah ibn Abi Rabi'ah, to basically bribe Najashi into sending back those Muslims. So Abdullah ibn Abi Rabi'ah and Amr ibn al-As, they come and they have, skins of leather. That was obviously the prized commodity of the time. And they have food and all kinds of things. And before they meet with Najashi, they go to each one of the generals and the commanders of Najashi's army, and they start to bribe them, and they give them these gifts, and they say, listen, there's some rebels from our country that have taken refuge in your country. They left our religion and they don't practice yours, meaning they don't belong to our religion, nor do they belong to yours. They fabricated a new religion which is rejected by you and rejected by us. So this religion that they have, it's not the monotheism that you think, and it's not polytheism, it's not idol worship. They're not like you, they're not like us, they're just rebels. And they said to them that, look, our leaders have sent us to Najashi to get them back. So he said, when we speak to Najashi tomorrow, and we ask him for them, then make sure that you also advise him to send them back. So they bribed all of these generals, basically, that when we have this gathering with the Najashi, make sure that you push them and say, yeah, give them back, they're rebels, and so on and so forth. So the generals all agreed because they brought some really, really good stuff. So in Najashi, he has this meeting, he has this assembly. Amr and Abdullah, they come to Najashi and they tell him the same thing. The generals of a Najashi, they're all saying, yeah, you should listen to them. These are rebels. They have no place here. They don't have our religion. They don't have their religion. Najashi was infuriated. He said, you want me to surrender a people that came here seeking safety? He said, Wallahi, I never will. He says, no one who seeks my refuge and settles in my country and trusts me is going to be betrayed. So he says, I'm going to hear their case. I'm going to hear them out. If they are as you say they are, then I'll send them back. Otherwise, they'll stay here under my protection and hospitality. Now, Abu Talib is back in Mecca, and Abu Talib heard about Amr ibn al-As going there. And Amr ibn al-As was a brilliant man. SubhanAllah, he was against, he worked against Islam and then for Islam, right? When he was against Islam, it was a tragedy. So Abu Talib, when he heard about Amr ibn al-As, he writes this long poem to Najashi. So he sends a letter to Najashi as well. And he's saying, basically the gist of it, he says, is the Najashi still going to treat Ja'far and his companions kindly? Or has the Fattan, the one who corrupts, the evildoer, Amr ibn al-As, prevented him? He said, you are a noble and a generous man. May God protect you. No refugee has ever been disappointed by you. Know that Allah has increased your happiness and prosperity has always found its way to you. He said, you are a river whose banks overflow with bounty, and that bounty reaches both your friends and your enemies. So he writes this poetry in praise of Najashi. Knowing that Amr ibn al-As radiallahu ta'ala anhu was there, and that he's trying to basically lead him to give back the Muslims. So Najashi says, I'll summon them. We'll bring them all together. I'm going to hear them out, and if they're these rebels like you say they are, that's fine. I'll give them back. So Najashi brings these Sahaba in this court of his, all of his generals, as well as Amr and Abdullah. And whenever he walks in, everyone bows except for the Muslims. So this is really against them right away. SubhanAllah, they're not making their case right away. They don't bow. And it was the tradition to bow. So he says, why don't you bow? And they say that, we've been taught by our Prophet only to bow to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The generals started to, they started to mumble amongst themselves. They were really offended by that. And then Najashi told them to be quiet. He said that that's good. He basically praised their action of not bowing. So he asked Ja'far, he asked them, he said, who is your representative? Let someone amongst you come and address me. So they chose Ja'far radiallahu ta'ala anhu. Ja'far was only 21 years old. But Ja'far looked like the Prophet ﷺ, so he had a beautiful appearance, and he was known for his eloquence and his courage. So Ja'far radiallahu ta'ala anhu stands up and he gives possibly, subhanAllah, the most eloquent speech ever about Islam. He says that we were a people in a state of ignorance and immorality, worshipping idols, eating the flesh of dead animals, committing all sorts of abomination, and were completely shameless. We used to break the ties of kinship. We used to treat our guests badly. The strong amongst us used to exploit the weak. We remained in that state until Allah sent us a prophet, one of our own, whose lineage, truthfulness, trustworthiness, and integrity were well known to us. You could do a whole da'wah seminar based on this, subhanAllah, what he's pointing to of the Prophet ﷺ. He says he called us to worship Allah alone and to renounce the stones and the idols which we and our ancestors used to worship besides Allah. He commanded us to speak the truth, to honor our promises, to be kind to our families, to be helpful to our neighbors, to cease all prohibited actions, to abstain from bloodshed, to avoid obscenities and false witness, and to not appropriate an orphan's property or slander a pure woman. He ordered us to worship Allah alone and not to associate anything with Him, to uphold the prayer, to give the zakah. We believed in Him and what He brought to us from Allah, and we follow Him and what He asked us to do, and we keep away from what He forbade us from. When He came to us, our people attacked us, and they inflicted the severest punishment upon us to make us renounce our religion and take us back to our old ways and to the worship of the idols. They oppressed us and they made life intolerable for us. They obstructed us from observing our own religion. So we left for your country, choosing you before anyone else, desiring your protection and hoping to live in justice and peace in your midst. The Arabic is far more eloquent, but subhanAllah, even the translation is eloquent, right? I mean, this was Ja'far's address to Najashi. Najashi, subhanAllah, he was touched. He said, do you have anything from the revelation that came to you from your Prophet? Ja'far radiallahu anhu, in his hikmah, in his wisdom, he recited from Surah Maryam. So he recited from Surah Maryam up until مَا كَانَ لِلَّهِ أَن يَتَّخِذَ مِنْ وَلَدٍ سُبْحَانَهُ, that it is not befitting for Allah to take a son, subhana. You know, He's exalted from that. So when he recited that, Najashi and the bishops, they all cried. Right? These were very touching words. SubhanAllah, you can imagine the first time they're hearing Surah Maryam. And Najashi, he stood up and he said, what you have brought and what Isa alayhi salam have brought, what Jesus, peace be upon him, have brought, are from the same niche. And he drew a line in the sand and he said that what is between us and you is no greater than this line. Meaning you are just like us. And he said, you can go. And he said, Wallahi, he turned to Amr and he said, Wallahi, I will never give them up to you and they will never be betrayed. So Amr was rejected, Abdullah was rejected, and they left this gathering. And Amr, radiallahu ta'ala anhu, at that time, again, he's against Islam, he didn't want to give up. Abdullah said, let's just go back home and tell him that it didn't work out. Amr didn't want to give up. So he says to Abdullah ibn Abi Rabi'a, he says, look, I know what I can do to make him change his mind. So he said, what? So Amr says that I will tell him that they said that Jesus, that Isa alayhi salam, is nothing more than a creature. He's nothing more than a creation. So basically I'm going to tell him that they offend Isa alayhi salam. They don't believe he's the son of God, they're not like you, and so on and so forth. So he told Najashi that they say that Isa alayhi salam is nothing but a creature. And Najashi summoned them once again. So this was the second time they're standing. So he said to Ja'far, he said, tell me what you say about Isa alayhi salam. So Isa alayhi salam, so Ja'far radiallahu anhu said that we say that Isa alayhi salam is a messenger of Allah, that he was born of a virgin birth and so on and so forth, and he is al-Masih, and he says all these things about Isa alayhi salam. And that's when Najashi, he takes his stick and he says, Wallahi ma kharaja Isa ibn Maryam an hadha al-'ud. He said that Isa alayhi salam did not give to himself more than this line. He did not go anywhere beyond this. Now obviously when he says that, when Najashi says that, he's saying that Isa is not the son of God. He's saying that Isa is not God. He's rejecting the Trinity. So when he says this, he's putting himself in a very dangerous situation. And subhanAllah, the generals and the bishops were so outraged that they started to grunt. And Najashi said, even if you all grunt, even if you all don't like it, he said that they will be free in my country. And he said, whoever curses you will be fined. SubhanAllah, Najashi said, if the people even curse the Muslims, they'll be fined. And he said, Wallahi, not for a mountain of gold. Even if they gave me a mountain of gold, would I allow anyone to hurt you? And that's when he made his famous statement, that Allah did not accept a bribe. so why should I accept a bribe? So he said, I'm not going to allow anyone to hurt you. And that's when Najashi, he actually gave them back their bribes. He gave Amr back his bribe. He gave Abdullah back his bribe. And Najashi told everyone to leave the room except for Ja'far radiallahu ta'ala anhu. So he dismissed his bishops, he dismissed his generals, he dismissed the Muslims, he dismissed Amr and Abdullah. And he privately took Shahada with Ja'far radiallahu anhu. So this was actually, Najashi did not wait to accept Islam. He took Shahada with Ja'far radiallahu anhu privately in the same gathering. Now, Urwa radiallahu ta'ala anhu, Aisha radiallahu anha, she says that sometime after that, so this is also part of the history that we don't know about him. Sometime after that, there were people that rebelled against him. And we were afraid that they would remove him. So they met at the Nile for a battle. So the people met at there was just a revolt against him. It wasn't religiously based or anything like that. There was just a revolt against him. So they met at the Nile for a battle. So we wanted to know what was going on. I said Aisha said this, right? I meant Salama. I'm sorry. Because Salama was there. Aisha was not there. So she said, we saw these armies meeting at the Nile, the army of Najashi and the army against Najashi, and we wanted to know what was going on. So Zubayr radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he was the youngest of us and he was the fittest of us. So as Zubayr radiallahu ta'ala anhu, we told him to swim into the Nile and to observe what was happening. So Zubayr radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he swam in the Nile to go close to see, what was happening with this battle. The army of Najashi won. So as Zubayr radiallahu anhu, he swam back, and he swam back shouting Allahu Akbar. And when he shouted Allahu Akbar, Salama radiallahu ta'ala anha says, we all started to shout takbir. And subhanAllah, listen to what she says. She says, Wallahi, I don't think we were ever so happy and relieved. So Najashi came back and Allah established him after destroying his enemy. And the chiefs of the Abyssinians submitted to him once again. And she said, we were in the best condition all the way until we returned to the Prophet ﷺ. Meaning we lived in the best state of affairs. And by the way, some Muslims would remain in Abyssinia even after the Hijrah. Right? I mean, we lived in the best situation in that time. When Rasulullah ﷺ sent to Najashi, because Rasulullah ﷺ used to send letters to all of them. The letter that he sent to Najashi, it said, in the name of Allah, the most compassionate, the most merciful, from Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to Najashi, the king of Ethiopia. He says, Assalamu alaik, peace be unto you. He said, I thank Allah for you, the Lord by which there is no God but Him, Al-Malik, Al-Quddus, As-Salam, Al-Mu'min. So the Prophet ﷺ started to mention some of the names of Allah. He said, I bear witness that Isa alayhi salam, that Jesus was the son of Mary and is the Spirit of God and His Word. The word He gave to the pure believer Mary, and from this word she gave birth to Jesus. Allah made Jesus from His Spirit just as He made Adam alayhi salam from His hand. He said, I invite you and your people to believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I have written to you and I have advised you, so accept my advice. Wassalamu ala man ittaba' al-huda. The Prophet ﷺ said, peace be upon those who follow righteous guidance. This letter is actually preserved, by the way, the letter from the Prophet ﷺ to a Najashi. Najashi responded and he said, Assalamu alayka ya Rasulullah. In fact, he wrote back the letter from Najashi, Ashama, so he just said his name, not the king of Ethiopia, the ruler of Ethiopia. He just said from Najashi, Ashama, to Muhammad Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So by the way he addresses the letter, he's accepting the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He says, Assalamu alayka ya Rasulullah wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace be unto you, O Messenger of Allah, and the mercy and blessing of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, alladhi la ilaha illahu. By Him, beside whom there is no God. He said, I have received your letter in which you have mentioned about Isa alayhi salam. And he said, by the Lord of the heavens and the earth, Isa alayhi salam is not anything more than what you say he is. He said, we fully acknowledge that which you have been sent, that which you have been sent to convey to us. And we have taken care of your cousin and his companions. And he said, Ashhadu annaka Rasulullah, I bear witness that you are the messenger of Allah, confirming that which has come before you. He said, I pledge to you through your cousin, meaning Ja'far radiallahu anhu, and surrender myself through him to the Lord of the worlds. This letter is documented in Zad al-Ma'ad by Imam Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah ta'ala. Zad al-Ma'ad, the whole letter, the exchange between the Prophet ﷺ and Ashama and Najashi is actually documented. So Najashi secretly becomes Muslim. He meets with the Muslims frequently. He learns what he needs to about Islam. Now realize up until this point there's no salah, like there's no 5 prayers. There isn't much from a ritualistic perspective to be a Muslim. It's really mostly tawheed. So for him, he doesn't know much about, he doesn't really need to do much to be Muslim, but he secretly is with them. The Muslims know that he's Muslim. The Christians, though they suspect that he might have become Muslim, they still think he's Christian. So Najashi is walking this very fine line. Some of the interactions we see with him though, subhanAllah, this is a very beautiful one, is with Habiba radiallahu anha. Habiba was the daughter of Abu Sufyan. And she became Muslim. She was disowned by Abu Sufyan. And she made hijrah to Habasha, she made hijrah to Abyssinia, while she was pregnant with her husband Ubaidullah ibn Jahsh. So Habiba and Ubaidullah, they made hijrah to Abyssinia. And she sees this dream of Ubaidullah with a disfigured face. And so she wakes up and he confesses that he left Islam. So Ubaidullah ibn Jahsh actually became Christian once again. Before Islam, he became Christian. And in Abyssinia, Ubaidullah left Islam. And in fact, he used to drink wine and he became an alcoholic. And he passed away. Now you can imagine, subhanAllah, how tragic this was for Habiba radiallahu ta'ala anha. You know, she's in the middle of nowhere. She made hijrah. Her father has disowned her. Her husband left Islam and died in a state of kufr. And she has a young daughter and she has no one around her. So Habiba sees another dream, and in this dream someone is saying to her, al-Mu'mineen, the mother of the believers. And that title obviously is reserved only by the Prophet's wives, alayhi salatu wassalam. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he sent a letter. She wakes up to know that the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam sent a letter to Najashi with Amr ibn Umayyah. And the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said to Najashi that I want you to be my wakil, I want you to be my representative, and I want you to ask Habiba if she wants to marry me. And the Prophet ﷺ told Najashi in this letter that if she agrees to marry me, then I want you to perform the wedding ceremony on my behalf. SubhanAllah, what an honor that's been. I mean, they've never met. SubhanAllah, the Prophet ﷺ has never met, but this is the closeness that they had. So Najashi sends a servant to Habiba. That same day she wakes up from that dream by the name of Abraha. So not the famous king that destroyed, that tried to destroy the Kaaba and was destroyed in Surah Fil. But Abraha, in fact, was a female servant, a young girl. And Najashi sends her to Habiba to give her the news. Habiba radiallahu anha says, when I was sitting down, I was trying to make sense of this dream that I had. Abraha entered upon me and she gave me the news, and I was so happy that I started to scream Allahu Akbar. So I started to scream takbirat. And she said, I gave Abraha all of my jewelry, and I gave her all of my perfume, and I gave her all of my money. Habiba was just so happy that she just started to shower everything she had, all these gifts on the servant. And Abraha, she asked Habiba one thing. She said, I only have one favor from you. When you meet the Prophet ﷺ, convey my salam to him. SubhanAllah, this young girl, all she wants, so she's a believer. She says, the only thing is when you meet the Prophet ﷺ, you send my salam to him. So Habiba accepted the proposal. Najashi said to her to choose a wali, to choose someone to represent her. So she chose Khalid ibn Sa'id ibn al-As. Why did she choose? Khalid ibn Sa'id ibn al-As was her closest relative. So he was a cousin to Habiba radiallahu anha. The family of al-As and the family of Abu Sufyan are related. So Habiba chose Khalid ibn Sa'id ibn al-As to be her wali. And you can imagine, subhanAllah, Najashi, he has a secret wedding. He invites all of the Muslims to his palace. And he has this beautiful, he decorates his palace. So he has it decorated lavishly, all right? Luxuriously, he lights the hall, he gathers all of the Muslims, and Ja'far ibn Abi Talib attends, Abdullah ibn Hudhafa attends, some of the greatest of the companions, they attend this wedding. And Najashi, who's acting on the part of the Prophet ﷺ, he's the one conducting the marriage on the part of the Prophet ﷺ, he himself gives her a mahar of 400 gold dinars, right, which is a huge mahar. All right, we're talking about tens of thousands of dollars. So he decides to give the mahar on the part of the Prophet ﷺ, to her. And he even gives a khutbah at this wedding. So we find that there's a khutbah that's documented at this wedding. When the marriage was finalized, he addresses this gathering of Sahaba. And subhanAllah, you can imagine how hard it is now for him to keep his Islam undercover, right? So what ends up happening is that the generals in Abyssinia, they start to suspect that Najashi is Muslim. Okay? So they have this meeting with him, and Najashi knows that they're about to approach him and ask him if he's secretly Muslim or not. So Najashi takes a piece of paper, and he's an intelligent man. You can see his intelligence in these different types of situations. He writes, La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah on it. He puts it in his shirt pocket. Okay? So when his generals come to him and they ask him, is it true that you've forsaken your religion and you're not a Christian anymore and you've accepted the religion of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and so on and so forth? Najashi says, well, what do you believe? So they said, we believe that Jesus is the Son of God and His Spirit, and that we affirm the Trinity and so on and so forth. Najashi says, and wallahi, I believe nothing more than this. So he's pointing to his shirt pocket where the notes that says, La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah is. He says, wallahi, nothing more than this. He says, I believe nothing other than this. So his generals leave and he continues, and Najashi writes his wasiyah, he writes his will. And in his will, he basically puts that he was a Muslim, and he asks for all of his rights, all of everything to be done as a Muslim. And so how did subhanAllah, we find out that he was dead? The Prophet ﷺ receives divine revelation. This is powerful. The Prophet ﷺ wakes up one day, and this is in the 9th year after Hijrah. So this is like right before the Prophet ﷺ passes away. And the Prophet ﷺ stands up in the masjid, and he stands on the manbar, and he says, لَقَدْ مَاتَ الْيَوْمِ رَجُلٌ صَالِحٌ. A righteous man has passed away today. Was there any way for the Prophet ﷺ to know that? Right? Anyone send him a text message from Abyssinia? No. So Jibreel alayhi salam informed the Prophet ﷺ that Najashi passed away. But just think about that statement for a moment. Like, the Prophet ﷺ is saying, a righteous man just died. Allah sends Jibreel to inform you that this man that you've never met just passed away. And the Prophet ﷺ says that he is rajulun salih, the greatest testimony that you could get from the Prophet ﷺ. He is a righteous man. And the Prophet ﷺ ordered the Sahaba to line up in rows, and Rasulullah ﷺ led janazah upon him, which is the only time in history that we know of the Prophet ﷺ praying as-salah ala al-ghaib, praying janazah on someone who's not present. This is the only, and this has caused all types of issues in fiqh. Every school of thought has a different approach to salah ala al-ghaib. Why? Because some would say, well, this was something that was just for Najashi. Some would say, well, this is a Muslim who doesn't have people to pray on him. Some would say that, well, if he's a Muslim of great importance to the ummah, then you pray salah ala al-ghaib, even if janazah has taken place. So you have all these fits in fiqh that, this whole long chapter of a salah ala al-ghaib is because the Prophet ﷺ insisted on praying on An-Najashi radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. And this was again in the year 9 after Hijrah. Aisha radiyallahu anha, she says that the grave of An-Najashi was seen by many Muslims. Many Muslims passed by his grave and they went to visit him. And she says that multiple Sahaba testified to a nur that was coming from the grave of An-Najashi. Allahu Akbar. SubhanAllah. Multiple companions would see light coming from his grave. And this was a man who never met the Prophet ﷺ, who loved the Prophet ﷺ to that level, who contributed so much to Islam. And so Ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala says he's considered the best of the tabi'een. He's not a sahabi, he's a tabi'i. Technically speaking, he's a tabi'i. So he's considered the best of the tabi'een. Now I told you guys Hollywood inspiration and movies and all of these things. Any of you guys guessed the movie that this inspired? So this is a fun fact, all right? The movie Lion King was inspired by the story of An-Najashi. In fact, the original producer of the Lion King musical is an Ethiopian by the name Negus, who's named Najashi. So the story of Mufasa and Simba and all that kind of stuff, it's basically Najashi, except it's lions and hyenas, okay? But subhanAllah, that's a true story that which we can tell our kids proudly that, you know, that Lion King was inspired by the story of this great man, Ashama, radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be pleased with him and with his sacrifices for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to join us with him and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the companions in Jannat al-Firdaus. Allahumma ameen. Inshallah ta'ala, we'll continue with Bilal ibn Rabah radiyallahu ta'ala anhu.